Professor Mishra, I guess I should start introducing Professor Danino. Right?
Yes, yes. I formally welcome Padma Shri Professor Michel Danino to this department lecture series of Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation to deliver a talk. And I now request Professor Sanjit Mishra of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, who happens to be the coordinator of this department lecture today, to introduce the speaker. Now it is over to Professor Sanjit Mishra.
Thank you so much, Professor Mishra. Thank you so much. So, I'd like to begin with what our Sanskrit scholars had said long ago. Vidyutang cha nipatang cha naiva tulyang kadachana swadeshe pujate raja idvan sarvatra pujate. A learned scholar and a mighty king cannot and do not stand on the same pedestal. The two cannot be compared for the simple reason that the king is confined to the boundaries of his own nation, while the scholar's fame is not limited to the physical boundaries of the place of his birth or wherever he lives. The learned are revered everywhere, all the time. That's how I'd like to introduce Honorable Padma Shri Michel Danino to you, who has kindly consented to be the speaker of the day. But before that, I would like to read out the abstract of his talk before I formally read out his brief profile. So here is the abstract of his talk. The emergence of the Harappan cities some 4,600 years ago remains wrapped in mystery in the span of a century. We witness the spread of unexpectedly standardized concepts and practices, whether in town planning, the use of auspicious proportions, weight units, technologies, pottery motifs, writing system, or religious concepts. What held together this vast network of cities, towns, and villages covering a third of modern India seems to have been intensive trade and a shared ideology rather than strong governance or a military order. In less than a millennium, this millennium civilization witnessed the disintegration of its urban order, leaving a rich cultural legacy, but also questions as regards its inherent sustainability, questions that face us today again, though in a very different context. Here is a brief profile of Professor Michel Danino, Padma Shri. French-born Michel Danino has lived in India since 1977. Student of Indian civilization, he has written on protohistorical India, the Lost River on the Trail of the Saraswati 2010, and Indian culture. And the name of the book is Indian Culture and India's Future, which was published in 2011. Sri Aurobindo and India's Rebirth, an edited volume which appeared in 2018. He has lectured and taught at several education institutions. Since 2011, he has been teaching courses on Indian civilization and knowledge systems at IIT Gandhinagar, where he is currently a visiting professor and coordinator of its Archaeological Sciences Centre. He is also convener of the CBSE committee for the course Knowledge, Traditions and Practices of India, whose two-volume textbook he co-edited with Professor Kapil Kapoor in 2013 and 2015 respectively, and a member of several scholarly and government bodies, including the National Steering Committee for the implementation of the National Education Policy 2020. In 2017, the Government of India awarded him Padma Shri for his work on education and culture. It was only a brief profile of Professor Michel Danino. Let's hear what wonderful things he has to share with us. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Anindya Mishra and Professor Sanjit Mishra for this very kind invitation. I remember very fondly our two visits to IIT Roorkee, the first being probably about 15 years ago, and the beautiful campus and the wonderful ambience there. And I wish this would be an in-person visit, but we have to be happy with the technological means at our disposal. And therefore, I'm taking advantage of this to involve you in a kind of a reflection on this this last phase and disintegration of the Indus or Harappan, also known as Indus Saraswati civilization. Why Indus Saraswati, we will see towards the end of this presentation. And basically, my plan is quite simple. It is to, first of all, take you through a visit of this civilization so that we get a kind of a broad idea of how it functioned, because it has certain quite unique features if we compare it with contemporary civilizations in ancient Egypt, in Mesopotamia, what goes by the name broadly of the Bronze Age civilizations. So the Bronze Age civilizations, they were, as I said, Egypt, Mesopotamia, there was one in China, but there were also a few elsewhere in Africa, in the Americas, and basically this was the emergence worldwide of urbanism. And human societies had grown more and more complex during the Paleolithic and then the Neolithic stages, and they reached a point where to be more efficient in trade contacts, in exchanges, they found that an entity called a city, was more advantageous. And this is something which happened all over the world, of course, and we have this emergence of cities quite independently, first of all in Mesopotamia, secondly in Egypt, and thirdly in the Indian subcontinent. If we can mute everyone, it will be
Please
helpful.
mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves. Other than Professor Danino, please mute yourselves. Please ensure that you are muted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So let me share some slides which will help me to take you through this visit, and then you will be able to follow more concretely what I have in mind. So this is one famous view of the so-called Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, where we have, I'm sorry, I think I should, yeah. Where we see one of these imposing structures, we will return to them, whose purpose still, because don't forget that the script of the Indus civilization is not yet deciphered. So therefore, the civilization, unlike the Mesopotamian, unlike the Egyptian, is completely mute. It doesn't talk to us. Only the physical remains talk to us. And then archaeologists have to interpret them. So there is no supporting literature, in other words. Even if one day the script is deciphered, we still will not have a supporting literature, because the inscriptions on the seals mostly, and ornaments and pots and so on, are so very short. So probably this civilization will remain a mystery for a long time to come. But there are certain things which archaeologists have tried to put together, and after almost exactly 100 years of excavations, we now have at least some certainties, but a lot more question marks. So I want to take you through a brief visit, as well as a reflection of what could have caused its demise, because this phenomenon of urbanism, which, as I said earlier, is contemporary with one in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in China, and a few other parts of the world, is going to be rather short-lived in the context of this Indus civilization. Here you can see one important piece of data, which is that this civilization is much larger in extent, much larger than the other civilizations like China, Mesopotamia, or Egypt. It's actually larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. So this is going to, in fact, create a special kind of a problem that archaeologists and other, scholars have tried to reflect upon, which we will come back to. This huge expanse and how all this region, which is, all the northwest of India, including Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, and all the way to the Iranian border, and all the way down to northern Maharashtra, all the way down to western Uttar Pradesh. It's almost 1/3 of modern India. So it's a considerable extent, and this raises certain unique problems, which we will come to briefly. This is a map which I drew long ago. It needs to be a little bit updated, but broadly, for our purpose today, it is sufficient. It gives you an idea of the concentration of sites, initially in the Indus Valley, and hence the name Indus Valley Civilization. But archaeologists now do not accept the word valley, even though it continues in popular imagination, because the Indus Valley ends up having far fewer sites than those found in the valley of a bygone river, which was identified in the 19th century with the Saraswati. I will not have time to trace the history of the rediscovery of the Saraswati River, which is quite interesting in itself. I will only say that the identification of this river, which is also known as Ghaggar in India and Hakra in Pakistan, therefore Ghaggar Hakra, this identification of it with the bygone Saraswati of Vedic literature is not at all a recent scholarly input. It is rather something which was completed in the 19th century, by 1855, in fact. Some geographers and Indologists and Sanskritists had put together the descriptions in the texts and the discovery of this dry bed by British topographers and geographers. So it's not at all a new identification, contrary to what we often hear in the media. And moreover, I would like to say that though we say dry bed, actually during powerful monsoons, and this was the case again in 2019, before that in 2010, you will find the Ghaggar flowing very massively with a huge width of almost a kilometer, and flowing down to this region, which is Haryana here, and then Rajasthan, a little bit of Punjab also. So this river is not completely dead. It can be reactivated, but of course during very good monsoons. And let's not forget also that there are a number of canals which have been cutting across its course and diverting most of the remaining waters to irrigation purposes. So anyway, this is all I will say for the time being on the Saraswati, but we will come back to the problem of the disappearance of the Saraswati, because it may have a connection with the disappearance of the civilization itself. Now, keep in mind, for today, I am taking a very conservative definition of the word civilization. I am using this as a synonym for a state organized around cities with trade networks, internal, external, developed technologies, administrative control, a running system, It's all of this which archaeologists define civilization. People use the word very, very loosely. They will say Indian civilization in the Paleolithic. No. From that point of view, there is no civilization. There may be cultures, which is different. And archaeologists use the word culture also in a very specific meaning of a whole set of physical remains that are consistent with each other and that build up a certain individuality. So those are material cultures. And of course, that can go back even millions of years. Why not? So we have to distinguish between culture and civilization. And we are talking now about the emergence of this civilization. As you can see here, about 2600 BC is when all of a sudden, many of these cities come on the landscape. Some of them were preceded by earlier settlements, and that is known as the early Harappan phase. And some of those early Harappan settlements were already growing into sizable towns, and therefore the continuity with the city was quite logical and natural. But in many other locations, about half of them, according to the American archaeologist Gregory Purcell, many of the cities were established on blank terrain, on virgin soil, almost, you might say. So therefore, this emergence within about 100 years is something of a mystery. What prompted the early Harappans, preceding the urban phase, to create all these cities? What enabled this creation? Because creating a city requires a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, a lot of state control. All these questions are still being debated, and I will not spend too much time on them. Towards the end, we will still have a little bit of a reflection. So let me now proceed and with one big question, which is critical to our discussion today, which is that, you see, if I go back to the previous, initially Mohenjo-Daro was discovered as a major city about 1922, and excavations went on for several decades, and it turned out to be quite a huge city. I'll show you the plan in a moment. And this city, which was sizably larger than all others which were being discovered at the time, was assumed to be the capital of this Indus Valley civilization. But when the civilization expanded, especially after independence, Indian archaeologists worked a lot in Gujarat, in Haryana, Punjab, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, and so on. Then not only the term valley was no longer adequate, but the question was, could Mohenjo-Daro, which is, as you see, way back in the western sector, could it have been still a capital for this entire region? In other words, was this a kind of a centralized empire where Mohenjo would have been the capital and there would have been some emperor sitting there somewhere? This was a valid question, but most archaeologists believe that the answer is more in something like this, where we have different regions. I will not go into those details, they would take us too far. Different regions which are identified again by individual developments of cultural remains, where each of these regions is certainly connected with all the rest, and there's a wide sharing of standardization of pottery, of seals for trading, of ornaments, various technologies, even agricultural techniques to some extent, though that will vary regionally quite a bit also. And also of ideology, like what we could call loosely religion, for example, religion and culture. There's a lot of sharing. There's a lot of commonalities across all those regions. And yet, each of them has a little kind of a, regional stamp, individuality. It's very much the same today in India, after all. You do have a kind of a pan-Indian culture, something recognizably Indian, maybe hard to define, but still recognizable across the whole subcontinent. But it doesn't mean that you cannot speak of Tamil culture, Gujarati culture, and and so on and so forth, Bengali culture and so on. So it could be something similar already in seed. And then in that case, we would have rather a kind of a conglomeration or confederation of regional powers. City-states is a term that Possehl uses on the pattern of ancient Greece. I think it might be a little inappropriate. We could more conservatively call it regional powers, which somehow, and that is another big question mark, agree to work together, because obviously they are benefiting from this working together. And therefore you'll find a lot of trade going on. For example, here you will have, if you can follow my cursor, the very important site in the run of Kutch of Dholavira, which last year was recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Site. And from Dholavira, where there was some stone material available, beautiful colored stone, which could be easily worked because it was not too hard. And we find some segments of pillars traveling all the way to Harappa, the city of Harappa, which is somewhere here. So, and this means an upstream travel across the Indus and then the Ravi River. Not easy with big, heavy pillar sections. And yet it happens. So there's a very close-knit interaction which basically creates this civilization, you might say. And yet all these regions have their individuality. All right, so I will continue now with a very quick visit. I'll not go too much into deep in details. I will sometimes move a little faster because I want to keep some time for our discussion at the end. But this is the upper city, upper part of Mohenjo-Daro, also called Acropolis, where you can see that, first of all, and this is important because these norms, these concepts are going to be spread almost across all the cities, though adapted to the local topography or maybe other factors which we don't always know. And one which is very striking is the orderliness of the planning. See those very, very straight streets, these are oriented exactly north-south. And there are perpendicular streets, east-west. And there are large buildings. This is again the Great Bath. This is a huge building called the so-called the college, but we don't really know. Perhaps this is where the rulers and the immediate dependents were living. There's a huge building here which was miscalled the granary. It's probably not a granary, some kind of a warehouse. Then this central portion is much eroded, unfortunately, and then you have another set of large buildings like this one, which is called the Assembly Hall. It has rows, 5 rows with pillars and so on. So this is clearly where something like the state, the administration was located, the rulers, if you like. Though very interestingly, the rulers are almost invisible in the Harappan civilization. Unlike ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was displayed everywhere, the pharaoh was almost divinized, and you find him or her sometimes in temples, portrayed in palace panels, in the pyramids sometimes, and so on. So the pharaoh is definitely someone everybody looks up to. Now, there is no identifiable portrait of a Harappan ruler, nothing which is clearly a portrait of a king, an emperor. So this is already a little peculiar, and I'll come back to it later. All right, so this is a view of where we were before, you see. We were looking at this citadel, and there are areas where people actually live, because not many people, perhaps some elite, but otherwise the common people would not have lived in the citadel. They lived in different areas which have been partly excavated. You see, the hatched area here, it shows only some of the parts which have been excavated, but there are lots of other portions which remain unexcavated. Most of it, in fact, most of it only 20% or so of Mohenjo-Daro has been excavated. And it probably extends even beyond the present excavated area. So it is undoubtedly a very large city. All right, so this is the granary I was showing you, so-called, hence the quotation marks, probably a warehouse, and the sketch shows you how elaborate those constructions were and how much planning would have gone into them. This is the great bath, again, elaborate construction. This is the basin. There's a colonnade around it, a veranda with pillars, rows of rooms were there for priests, were there for people who could change their clothes. It's not very, very clear. There are many hypotheses at work, but it is now assumed that this was not exactly a bath, rather like a basin where people would go for ritual ablutions, water rituals. So anyhow, and then this is in the lower, one of the areas excavated in the lower city, where you can see the density of habitations, very dense. You can still see that there's some broad orientation north-south and east-west of streets, but it's no longer as accurate as in the citadel. I mean, the Acropolis, the upper city. And you can also see that there are, interestingly, very large house complexes, like this one, for example, which is quite unique, or this one. And you have also smaller rows of houses of all kinds just in the same area. Interestingly, in Harappan cities, there is apparently nothing like the kind of huge urban disparity that you find in many modern Indian cities, where you have a posh area where you know that only the richest people can live. And then you may have very, very humble middle class, packed apartment blocks, and you may have slums. So you can see, you know, in Indian cities today, you know by just moving around and looking around, you know the kind of social class that lives there. But here, it's not so clear. And this disparity, though it's quite possible that in the unexcavated areas, there are much more humble sets of houses, even possibly slums. But so far, this is not exactly a kind of disparity that has become visible in any Harappan site, to my knowledge. So there seems to be, don't rush to idealize this as a perfect democracy. There is so much of unknown about this civilization, and definitely there are some very large houses and some very small ones. So there would be difference in economic and social classification, but perhaps people were still quite happy living together with, anyhow, at the end of the day, very similar quality of constructions, even though the houses may be much smaller, much humbler for some. The quality is the same. The materials are the same. The sanitation system connecting them all is the same. So there's something very interesting there that we need to understand. All right, so this is a very wide street in Mohenjo-Daro, about 9 meters. And you can see the brick houses. And Mohenjo-Daro is almost entirely made of baked bricks, fired in kilns, which means hundreds of millions of them. So therefore, a huge industry, and therefore, and keep that in mind because I'll come back to this later, and also therefore a state control, unless you can arrange for a manpower, unless you can pay for it in some way through some grains of wheat or some whatever it may be, you will not be able to manage such a construction on such a large scale. This is a small lane in Mohenjo-Daro, and in fact, there are lots of technical innovations there, which I will not spend time on. And then we see how some of the earlier British excavators, British archaeologists, were unimpressed. They were unimpressed because they were used to, Greco-Roman archaeology or to Egyptian archaeology, where you have a lot of spectacular buildings. Of course, the pyramids in Egypt, huge temples, magnificent frescoes with, lots of painted narratives and so on. All of that, and here nothing, just bricks and bricks and bricks and nothing. And therefore, Mortimer Wheeler, who worked in the 1940s as head of the Archaeological Survey of India, speaks of the miles of brickwork which alone have descended to us. However impressive quantitatively and significant sociologically are aesthetically miles of monotony. Now, this is something which has changed later, because then archaeologists started beginning that there were some very fascinating questions and features about this civilization, which were not so visible on the surface. So no pyramids, it is true, no big painted frescoes, that is true, but a lot of other things, like the sanitation system on a wide scale, which you don't have in Egypt or Mesopotamia, like this invisibility of the ruler, like the absence of an army. There is no clear evidence anywhere of an organized army which the state uses to keep the whole territory together. There's no such evidence anywhere. There are no specific weapons of warfare. There are things that can be used as weapons if you like, but also for other purposes, like a bow for hunting, like an axe for working or splitting wood, and so on. So no clear weapons of warfare, no barracks where soldiers would have lived, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this is another unexpected development, that apparently this civilization was not held together through a military order. So I'll come back to that. Sanitation, this is what I explained briefly, and you have here rows of bathroom platforms. All the individual drains are joining a common drain. This requires a tremendous amount of planning and organization, and the slope of those drains was carefully maintained at 1 to 2 centimeters a meter all over the city. So that requires enormous planning before even the city is built. Otherwise, you cannot have such a sanitation system in working order. So this is quite a feat. It is often partly repeated at smaller sites, but not always. Smaller sites do not really need this kind of sanitation, which would be essential in such a large city with possibly 50 to 70,000 inhabitants or even more. All right, this is a brief view of Harappa, where we have several mounds, and you have different gateways into them, and packed also density of habitation. And you have here the Ravi River flowing in the background, which is now, it has moved some 10 kilometers to the north of it. And here you have a view of some of the mounds, and you can keep this shape, little bits of a slanted rectangle, slanted. Keep it in mind for a brief while. So this is the same shape again. This is again at, and by the way, this came up with big questions. So first of all, this opening facing the riverbed, please keep that in mind also. The narrowed opening, and and then the existence of these fortifications. Why fortifications? What are their possible purposes? Now, Mortimer Wheeler, who was an army man, he was from the British Army, immediately assumed that this was for warfare. And therefore, he started picturing a big war with the incoming Aryans, and then the Aryans getting the upper hand, and then, the civilization disappearing as a result. Okay, that was in the 1940s and 50s. But since then, first of all, as I will repeat later on, there's absolutely zero evidence of such a phenomenon of Aryans or anybody else for that matter coming in the early second millennium BC, let's say about 1900 BC, and smashing the Indus cities. Definitely no evidence. And so what could be the purpose of these fortifications? So first of all, even if Wheeler is wrong on the invasion phenomenon, he may still be right that for some reason they felt the need for defenses. But they are very strange defenses. Sometimes they are not very, very workable. Sometimes they are too thick. Sometimes they are too thin. And they have these funny angles. So they seem to indicate other phenomena. So another is protection from floods. For example, if this Ravi River, which is very close by, obviously for the purpose of trade, they want to be able to load and unload goods on boats, river boats. If it goes into spate during a very powerful monsoon, for example, then you can protect at least this mound thanks to these fortifications. So that's an hypothesis. Control of trade has been proposed by many archaeologists, including Kenoyer, Jonathan Mark Kenoyer, American archaeologist who's worked a lot on the Indus civilization. And it is quite obvious that this is one purpose of these fortifications, because it will be the same in later historical India, where we will find that the rulers, in order to control the trade, derive revenue from the taxation, need to demarcate the urban space. And therefore, these fortifications serve this purpose also. And very often, in Harappan cities, some of the weights, famous Harappan weights, which were used in the trade, will be found near the gateway. Some of them, not always, also inside, for example, in large traders' houses, or sometimes even smaller houses. But near the gates, very much so. And this is the case at Harappa, which means that we can picture guards standing there and, weighing the goods that people were taking in or out. And so this is for control. Another hypothesis, which I worked out in a longish study of auspicious proportions in Harappan cities. I will not go into that today. Led me to the conclusion that there was a great need to define the urban space. It doesn't rule out the other factors, but it seems as if Harappans were kind of obsessed with defining their space in a very orderly manner. And finally, as a symbol of authority, according to the American archaeologist Piotr Eltsov, which is that instead of monumental pyramids, temples, palaces, maybe the rulers would have expressed their authority precisely through these falsifications. So this, of course, these are all good hypotheses, but all of them or some of them may also be valid together. This is one of the gateways into Harappa, very, very narrow, as you can see. The worker gives you the scale, and this is where often some weights have been found during excavations. Now we move to Kalimangan in Rajasthan, and you can see now we are near the Sarasvati, and you can see that Gagar or Saraswati, and you can see that there are two entrances facing the riverbed. I'll come back to that quickly at the end. And these rectangles again are slanted, just like at Harappa. Why this slant? Well, there are several hypotheses. I will not go into that, but basically we see that the models of urbanism are transferred from site to site, including the division between upper and lower city, right? So though you may have nice streets at right angles again, like at Mohenjo-Daro, you also have this dichotomy between upper, where perhaps the elite was living, and the lower city, where all the other inhabitants were living. This is a sign of economic affluence in Kalimangan, because you see those terracotta flooring tiles, and which is not an essential commodity for a good life, but it adds an element of luxury. And there are several such signs that the economy was basically thriving. Lothal is a well-known site, one of the earliest excavated in India, in Gujarat, almost at the border with Saurashtra. And here you see that I will not go into this whole dockyard controversy or hypothesis, but I do agree with the excavator Dr. S.R. Rao, that this very large basin must have been a dockyard, and this was a place basically of trade or a trade getaway with sites further into Saurashtra. And some of the large foundations of buildings like this warehouse, this central building where very likely the elite was living, and then a lot of other buildings. Again, we have a kind of a dichotomy. So this would be the upper town. It's a town, it's not a city. And below you would have the lower town. So and this is a group of students which I took in the pre-COVID era, and you can see behind this long dockyard of about 237 meters long, so quite huge for such a small site, and therefore there has to be some special purpose to it. These are bathing platforms at Lothal, even though it's a very, very small site. You see the care with which these fired bricks have been aligned to create this main drain into which all these individual bathing platforms are dropping their used waters. And this is a warehouse in Lothal, which looks sometimes like a kind of rough miniature of the warehouse in Mohenjo-Daro. This is the so-called Bazaar Street, so-called by the archaeologists. I will not go into the justification of those terminologies. And this is Dholavira, which I mentioned earlier, where we see now not two but three parts. The upper city is here, divided into two, like at Mohenjo-Daro or Kalimangan. The upper city was also divided into two, and the middle town and the lower town, where in this area, which is northeast, a lot of habitations were located. So there would be so much to say on this very important site. This is not what you will see today. You will see only, of course, ruins, foundations left, but this is a computer reconstruction of this area which I was showing you here, the castle, very, very thick fortification walls, and this is where the rulers very likely must have lived. But again, no particular building within it is identifiable as an obvious palace. So this is the castle and one entrance into it, the northern gate into the castle, quite monumental stone work, as you can see, because stone is available, this beautiful limestone is available on the Khadir Island, where this city is located. This is the eastern entrance, a lot of stonework again, and these are some of the main streets in the middle town, so further north from the castle area, and you can see streets crossing exactly at 90 degrees, and again you get a sense of an order, a very orderly development. Some more houses. We can briefly mention the question of water because it will play a part in the final discussion. And a lot of technological innovations like this well with trapezoid bricks to prevent the well from collapsing inward under the pressure of surrounding infiltrations. Sanitation again. So we have already seen, in a larger street, but this is in a smaller lane, and yet you find so much care taken in the construction of the drain, initially inside the house, and then outside the house. It passes below the boundary wall. There's a sump to collect any solid waste material and so on. So the whole thing very carefully thought out, and in fact sometimes some artistic innovations for the shape of those wells, which are unexpected, and but very, very much in conformity with what we know of Harappan art. Sometimes, like in Dholavira, where water infiltration is not so massive, on the contrary, there may be droughts affecting the site, then stone is good as a material to build those wells. And there are a few such wells in Dholavira, though most of the water system here depends on reservoirs, not on wells. And this is a storm water drain feeding some of the tanks in Dholavira, very, very large, as you can see, about 6 feet in height, so that it can capture the intense peaks of rainfall. These are some water structures, tanks basically, in the castle, and some of the much larger water structures outside the castle. This eastern reservoir is 73 meters in length. It's enormous, and it can contain millions of liters of water. And you can see 1, 2, and there's a third somewhere staircase going down into, so that people can still collect water as the level goes down. Even at the bottom here, there is a small step well, which could perhaps be a kind of seen as an extension of the main reservoir. And on the southern side, you have this beautiful rock-cut reservoir with a secondary reservoir within it, 33 meters, quite respectable size also. So all these were interconnected and working in ways which have still not been fully reconstructed. Agriculture, plough-based agriculture, this is a miniature model of a ploughshare, was producing crops like barley, wheat, millets, rice, and of course, there was a considerable amount of animal husbandry because the Harappans were meat eaters, like most people in proto-historical times, and therefore all these bones have been found and analyzed and listed. And I will not read this quotation completely, but we have a set of studies by Jennifer Bates, Cameron Petrie of Cambridge University, and their Indian collaborator, Professor R.N. Singh of BHU, which basically have concluded, and these are very recent studies, that previous hypotheses on Harappan agriculture were not quite correct. And actually, the whole phenomenon is very complex. It is adapted to local communities. There is no evidence of a powerful central control over agriculture, contrary to some initial hypotheses. And a lot of regional diversity is also visible. So as I say, the Indus civilization remains a distinctive, I'm sorry, I've lost my, distinctive and compelling case of early complexity, right? So this is one thing we should remember for agriculture because it's going to show us some adaptability. But there are also examples of continuity. I will not spend too much time on this one, except to say that some of the patterns of ploughing, like this one at Kalimangan with 2 perpendicular furrows, have persisted even till post-independence time. Today, perhaps not. And there are technical reasons here why they have chose to have 2 systems of furrow. Trade and script, briefly. So these are the civilizations we mentioned earlier. And also in the Gulf, Dilmun, Magan civilization, Elam, and we find that the Harappans were in touch with all of them. Harappan goods, pottery, jewelry, and probably timber, though timber is not traced today, was exported to all these regions. And these trade networks, this is a map I borrow from Professor Kenoya, show these trade networks have been well documented and show that Harappans were very interested in reaching out. What they imported from those regions is not very clear most of the time. It looks as if they didn't really need much from those regions, except perhaps some luxury goods, or perhaps from Oman, copper ore, and sometimes silver also has been proposed, but this is not very clear. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. These are some of the Harappan artifacts located in the Gulf, the top of the Gulf region, where the Mesopotamian civilization was, Euphrates and Tigris. And you can see seals, you can see jewelry, and these are all trademark items from the Harappan civilization. In fact, there are inscriptions to document this. And those lovely carnelian beads in particular, which were drilled in a very, very sophisticated way by the Harappans, were very much prized by the royal families in Mesopotamia. And these are some other examples of Indus pottery, typical ivory comb of Harappan origin found in Oman. There would be quite a lot more to say on this, but I want to move on. And this is the interpreter sitting probably on the lap of the ruler and conveying the message from this Harappan trader. This is a Mesopotamian tablet, conveying who of course has a sign of greeting, and conveying his message of greeting to the ruler who is listening. So very interesting evidence from there, much more in fact than back here from the Indian subcontinent. So those seals, those mysterious seals, have been almost always found in the context of trade. Once the trade disappears, the seals basically stop. And therefore, there must have been identifiers. There must have been like those business cards that some of you use to identify yourself. And they could have identified some rulers or some regions or some good types of goods, or possibly the guild, the association of traders that the particular trader represents or is sent by. We can only speculate, unfortunately, it's hard to say. This is the longest inscription, famous inscription found at Dholavira, but undeciphered once again. You can see that it has this wheel sign, spoked wheel, appears 4 times in this single inscription, which creates big problems of interpretation. But anyway, and this weight system, which I mentioned earlier, found all the way to the Gulf also, following certain 2 sequences, one of geometric growth and the other multiples of tens and hundreds and thousands of the earlier units. But very, very standardized. And then various crafts, which I will not spend too much time on. You can easily understand what is going on. The jewelry would require a much longer development, but we can see in particular the well-known Indian bangle, and this will be produced by Harappans in all kinds of material, including shell, metal, terracotta, and probably wood also, why not? So stonework and toys. There's a whole toy industry producing a large number of toys for children, from these toy cars to whistles and rocking bulls and so on. And cultural artifacts like these kind of masks, whether they were used for dramatic performances or whether they were used for perhaps some rituals, this remains again a matter of speculation. Ornaments, some of which are very familiar to us today, and there's a long list of examples of continuity in the Harappan civilization, like this anklet here. Here you have this sindoor, the parting of the hair, and also this wearing of bangles all along the arm, which is still practiced especially in the rural parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat. Games also, perhaps an ancestor of chess on the left and of modern dice on the right. All these are well known, they have been discussed quite a bit. And also conch shells worked in ways which we are still familiar with. And finally, symbols surviving. On the left is from Mohenjo-Daro, then from an inscription in Gujarat and from Fatehpur Sikri. So whatever the symbols mean at different times is one thing, but the continuity of the symbol is quite striking. And even the well-known swastika also. Plus other things like trees on a platform and so on. Now we come to the last part of this presentation, which is why do we say that 1900 BC the cities kind of disintegrate and disappear, which is a fact, though some of them may have lingered on for another 100 or 200 years. It's not a very sudden phenomenon. It is perhaps gradual. It depends. We need much better chronological control than we have today to be sure of what happens. So one factor which I've already kind of dealt with, which was early on assumed on the pattern of barbarians invading the Roman Empire or the Spanish colonizers invading the Inca Empire and so on, is that, this could have been a result of invasions. Well, very simply, there's no sign of anything like that on the ground. Archaeologists are unable to produce any evidence. Internal conflicts, always a possibility. A great drought, I'm coming to that. Drying up of the Saraswati also. Ecological degradation through overuse of resources is something which has been there's an attempt of a calculation by the American archaeologist Walter Service way back in the 1960s or 70s, and he came to the conclusion that with all their brick industry, handicraft industry, timber industry, and pottery industry, metal industry, the Harappans would have used a lot of firewood and depleted quite a lot of their forests. So let us keep that in mind for a couple of minutes. Finally, geographical overstretch, I will explain what I mean, and possible economic collapse with the end of the Mesopotamian trade in particular. So the question here is one of methodology, first of all. And we should be very clear that what we are looking at is not one clinching factor, but possibly several factors either converging together or else in a chain, one factor triggering another. So it's hard to be sure exactly what happens. It looks as if, except the first, it looks as if all others play some part. But I'll try to throw a little bit more light. First of all, by looking at the climate thing, and you can see here, I won't have time to explain, but what is now known as the 4.2 kilo-year drought. 4.2 kilo-year, 4,200 years ago, there was a big drought worldwide. And a lot of, from different regions of the world, as you can see, there are sharp, dips in the indicators of precipitation, of rainfall, and those indicators are different nature. I will not go into the details, but the evidence for once is pretty unanimous. So therefore, 2,200, if this northwest region of India was afflicted by a long drought doesn't mean that there's no rainfall anymore. It means that there is rainfall, but more irregular, with bigger, gaps in between two rainfalls, and also overall in lesser quantity. This is another study giving exactly the same reading. This is by Yama Dikshit and her team, and you see here again between towards the end of the mature phase, you can see that there is here a sudden. So this is inverted. This is about the density of gastropods, which depend on the amount of precipitation. So you can see again a confirmation of this. And so therefore, this is one factor which we have to keep in mind. Another one is this Saraswati Basin. And this is a map summing up all or most of the major tributaries of this Gaga River, which I mentioned at the start, and which, once it crosses the international border here, becomes the Hakra River. And here we find that there are a huge number of Harappan sites, as you can see here, where during the mature phase, this is my own map, but I can show you possibly better maps. This is my colleague, Professor V.N. Prabhakar, here at IIT Gandhinagar. where you can see more or less the same thing, density of sites in this entire basin, and also here in the Hakra Basin, the continuity of the Saraswati in Pakistan. So there's no doubt that this river plays a very important part, but what happens is that whereas initially you have a continuity of sites in the pre-urban phase, with a little break during the urban phase, in the post-urban phase, all these sites here disappear, all of them. And you are left with these sites here hugging the Shivalik hills. So some other sketches, maps by other teams confirm totally my story, which is that, and even those two red dots here are not quite correct, that suddenly there's an abandonment of the entire central basin of the Saraswati or Ghaggar. And you can see the result. This is again from Professor Prabhakar, and you can see that now there's nothing. All these sites have been deserted, including Kalimangan, which is here, deserted. And there were quite a few others. And here, because you still have streams coming down from the Shivaliks, even during a long drought, therefore you find people settling down. But we are no longer talking about cities, we are talking about rural settlements. People have reverted to a rural lifestyle. Suppose that tomorrow in Delhi or Mumbai, there's no longer any water supply, there's no longer any electricity supply, and there is no longer any bus service. What will people do? They will immediately remember some uncle or distant cousin in a village in Maharashtra, and they'll try to go there. You cannot live in a city if certain basic amenities are not guaranteed. But you can manage with a more simple lifestyle, perhaps, but good enough in a rural context. So this is what we see here. There is a devolution. There is a disintegration of the urban order and a reversion to rural lifestyles. Now, very briefly, this is a close-up view of the one area of the Saraswati Basin, where I wanted simply to show you that a lot of studies have been done on this whole complex system of the Ghaggar Hakra, very complex, and through remote sensing in particular, with a lot of also of sediment samples. You can see here all the points where sediments have been taken to document these paleo channels. A lot of paleo channels have been identified, and you get those lithologs of sediment studies, which give very, very different stories, interestingly. Even a short distance away, half a kilometer away, the story changes. You get, for example, here you get these gray sands of Himalayan origin in one area, and they disappear just a couple of kilometers away. So geologists have worked hard, and we have a number of studies, but you see the big challenge is this, that now you can see here all the paleo channels. All those lines are paleo channels, basically. It looks as if the entire region is nothing but paleo channels. It's almost true. And of course, there are some which are bigger than others, like this one, which is the present bed of the Ghaggar. But it makes the study of this entire story very complex and not a straightforward, it's not a single bed river that you are dealing with. So a lot of buried channels have been documented. This is the Saini and Tondon story of a study of 2009, where they detected through OSL dating. Also, they got the dates that you can see here. And Ka means kilo annum and BP before present. And they detected huge underground reserves of water in this region. But then since then, through resistivity studies, this is Rajiv Sinha of IIT Kanpur, more precise locations of the underground sand, water-bearing sand layers have been made with some of them holding huge amount of water again. So now, more recently, studies have concluded, like this one, for example, by Ajit Singh and Rajiv Sinha, that the mega river, the mega Saraswati, kind of got defunct between about 8,000 years ago. And by that time, it kind of lost its glacial sources, which were contributed mostly by the Satluj, possibly by the Yamuna also. I cannot go into the details, it's too complex, but this is partly challenged by more recent study. This one is by a young PRL scholar, Anirban Chatterjee, and his mentor Jyotiranjan Roy, and two more scholars. And they found more recent dates, in fact, all the way to 4.5 kilo annums in some locations. So again, the story is going to change depending of where you are looking. And it looks like the system went through certain revivals. You see here, even very close to the surface, you find this gray micaceous sands, which are indicative of glacial activity. So still some connection with either Satluj or Yamuna, or perhaps some source which got lost in the Shivaliks. There's even I'm going to skip this quotation, a more recent study done here at IIT Gandhinagar, piloted by Ajit Singh, where basically this major tributary of the Gagar, known as the Markanda, its valley was studied closely, and counterintuitively it was found that it was going into floods, occasional floods, even during the late Harappan phase, where we say that the Sarasvati system has collapsed. And therefore, it was still sending water way downstream to possibly some Harappan sites. So the picture is very complex and cannot be summed up too crudely. You see here the conclusion of this study, that larger flooding of the foothill rivers sustained flows in the downstream reaches of the Gangar-Hakra Paleo Channel during the late Harappan civilization. So now it is time, I'm going to skip this, it doesn't really matter to conclude and to revisit those different factors at work. First of all, undeniably, the increase of aridity, drought, the climate goes drier. It was wetter. There's considerable evidence now through most of the studies that it was generally wetter during the mature Harappan phase. So this is one. Two, the breakup of the Sarasvati. And again, without going into details, though there could have been intermittent revivals, nevertheless, the Gagar becomes in the second millennium BC reduced to a foothill river. So what kind of impact does it have on all these cities downstream? Like, well, I could still have shown you Kalimangan again, as we saw. This is Banawali, where, yeah, let me move this, Banawali, and you can see the dry bed of the Sarasvati just nearby. And this is Bhirana, which was explored more recently, again on the Sarasvati. So these sites are there because they need the presence of the river, even if it is a depleted river, to communicate better with the rest of the civilization. And therefore, this second element here is going to definitely make a considerable change to the sustainability of those cities. So water is definitely very important. So we have climate, we have water, and the third is environment, because you may have a climate change, but you may still have a good environment. If you have, if you've been within forests or in some very good grassland environment, it could still remain so for some centuries. That's not the case perhaps here, because we know that the Harappans have overused their natural resources, and this may have resulted, compounded with growing aridity, with some amount of desertification, some amount of loss of proper good habitat. So this we have seen. Then the question of trade, you see how far, what disrupted the trade? Was it that the Mesopotamian region was also affected? It was. and that they had to stop the trade with the Harappans? Or was it that the Harappans were affected first and could not sustain their trade? This is not clear. But again, we can say that this must have played a part in at least the loss of economic affluence for the civilization here. And therefore, in periods of economic or climate stress, did tension rise between different regions of the civilization? It's quite possible that this harmonious coexistence and collaboration which we had before was no longer so harmonious. But this is pure speculation. However, what seems likely is that, and this is in fact, I think Professor Dilip Chakraborty, who has said that perhaps there was a geographical overstretch, and therefore this civilization, which was very large and which had now some river communications were lost, and remember there was no military order. So it was hanging together through subtle threads of trade and culture. And during times of stress, these are affected. So it's possible that it simply fell apart because those regions found it very difficult to be together, to remain together, and to work together. So this is the landscape as we know it. And it shows also that urban environments are always fragile, always vulnerable, and that they can quickly turn to unsustainable environments. Whereas, of course, rural contexts are much more resilient, obviously, to climate change and to all kinds of changes that have always affected our civilizations. In fact, and I'll conclude with this thought, there's absolutely no guarantee that our present civilization will survive in its form. Not only with this, climate crisis that we know of, environmental crisis, which is a bit different from the climate crisis, but also the growing social tensions, social instability, political instability, and so on. It could well be that one day we all have, or your children or your grandchildren, all have to go back to village life, and something has to be restarted somewhere. This is, of course, in the lap of the future. We don't know, but it is a good reminder that civilizations are delicate things, and therefore they need care. And therefore, I leave you with this question in the end: are we taking sufficient care of our current civilization, and are we guaranteeing that after 1 or 2 or 300 years it will still be there? That is for all of us to reflect upon. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, perhaps we can spare a little time. I'm at your disposal.
Yeah, you can speak now. Can you?
Yes, now I can speak. Thank you, thank you. So it was really a wonderful lecture, wonderful talk by Professor Danino. Thank you so much, Professor. Now it's time for some interaction with the audience who have been waiting for this moment with a bated breath. So, audience, if you've got some questions, you are most welcome.
You're welcome.
Uh,
I'm happy to try.
Sir, I would ask a question. I have a query rather. Um, the way you have explained the journey of the Harappan civilization, and if we go to around 500 BC, we have these Mahajanpads which came up into the Indian peninsula, and they were towards the eastern side of the Indian. So if we see the northwestern, that was the Harappan civilization. Maybe is there any research or is there any finding which says that the movement happened towards inside the Indian peninsula and into this, source of the Ganga Yamuna belt? the Mahajanpads, if you say, the major concentration of the Mahajanpads and Janpads remained there after this civilization, let me say.
You are right, except that there are still a few Mahajanapadas in the
Mm.
northwest. There are still a few.
Yes, yes.
And even in central India, like for
Mm.
example, Ujjain is part of one,
Mm.
I forget its name immediately, but
Mm.
it goes all the way down to,
Avantika.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So therefore, but you're right, the center of gravity, if you want to call it,
Mm.
is
Mm.
more to the east. And in fact, there is some assumption, and I have myself explained it in my book on the Saraswati, that because of the breakup of the Saraswati River and the whole, you see, it's not as if people died. There is no evidence that people died en masse, but they had to migrate. So we know that they migrated towards the Shivaliks, but it's entirely possible that they crossed Ganga. You see, the Harappans had a few sites across the Yamuna, but not a single mature Harappan site across Ganga.
Yes.
Whether they did not feel the need for it, whether it was anyway too far away, whether it was that Ganga was difficult to cross, we don't know. But they didn't. Now, after we see some traces that late Harappans perhaps crossed to Ganga, and it's not as if the Gangetic Plains had no inhabitants. They already had. In the second millennium BC, there's considerable evidence of agricultural settlements all over the Gangetic Plains, at least even in the western and central Ganga plains. If I remember, Dr. Rakesh Tiwari, already 2,500 agricultural settlements were enumerated, which means that there was already a good amount of population. Of course, to us today, it would look almost desert, but there were people. So what you have to see is that, the Harappan civilization is roughly in the 3rd millennium BC. And Mahajanapadas, of course, begin in the 1st millennium BC. Maybe 500 BC is a bit pessimistic. I would say 600 or 700 BC according to current dates. And therefore, we have a gap of at least 1,000 years. And this period is now called a period of reorganization. You see, people migrated, but they still had some technologies. There's considerable evidence of survival of technologies, transmission of culture. I gave a few random examples, like, those ornaments, but even bead drilling remain. Metallurgical techniques, for example, copper bronze technology survived. So people, Harappans, did not suddenly forget everything. They were not able to recreate cities because that is another dimension. You need some kind of a state. But they still, were active even to some extent in smaller scale trade networks. So therefore, it's a very interesting hypothesis. I will not offer a final answer now because we need a lot of more research on this 2nd millennium BC. You see, all those intermediary cultures like this OCP, this greyware culture, all these cultures which are usually identified by the name of their characteristic pottery, they've not been sufficiently researched. We need a lot more data on them to be able to show that they offer a kind of continuity in the transition. And then, yes, you're right, further east, things will reorganize themselves. And again, we don't have a good chronology of which are the Mahajanapadas which emerged first. That also we don't know. So there are still a lot of unknowns, but broadly speaking, there are good grounds to support what you propose.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for your answer, sir.
Professor,
Hello, Professor.
Professor Danino, can you hear me?
Yes?
Can you please turn on your video while you are taking the questions, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I did not actually consciously turn it off. Maybe the slideshow turned it off. I'm sorry. I didn't notice.
No, sir. I thought I did not interrupt you while you were answering. So
No problem.
fine. So please, questions, please.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, hello, sir. Thank you so much for this lecture. It was an interesting talk. Myself Omkar Karmarkar, and I'm a PhD student from IIT Bombay. I have two small questions. One regarding the urban planning perspective. The southern parts of Saraswati civilization, especially the Gujarat and the Sindh portion, it comes into the very much earthquake prone zone. So, was there any earthquake resistant facilities which were found during the excavations of those cities? And second question is bit different. That if we look into the Rama's Vanvas, the path that was traversed, it mentions crossing Ganga and at Shringaverpur, which is northwest of Prayag, northwest of Allahabad, but it doesn't mention crossing of Yamuna. Would it mean that the time of which Ramayana talks about was before Drishadwati shifted from Saraswati to Ganga?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not able to understand all first of all, the initial questions on urban planning. I've not really grasped. Maybe you can repeat it later, but let me just answer the last one. See, first of all, Ramayana is a story. Whether these are exactly historical events will depend on which scholar you talk to. And it could be that there is some historical kernel there. It could be that it is entirely fiction, or it could be that it is quite factual to some, at least, extent of the plot. It's very hard to say. There is, at the end of the day, there is no strong archaeological evidence, and probably you cannot expect also any archaeological evidence for such a story. Maybe, of course, Professor Bibilal's hypothesis that all the Ramayana sites that he explored were of similar antiquity, going back to about 800 or 900 BC, according to him. Today we can push these dates back a little bit. Maybe that is a kind of good evidence, but you know, it's a delicate question. Now, even if somebody, let's say, forget about Rama, if somebody travels from Ayodhya to Chitrakoot, I don't think you need to cross Yamuna, do you? If you're going
Yes,
to
you would need to cross, but yeah.
if you cross at Sringverpur, which is just west of Prayagraj today, then you don't have to bother about the Yamuna as far as I remember, but this may have to be checked. See, some people have worked, and if you send me an email, I'll send you some work on the geography of the Ramayana. Some scholars, as you can well imagine, have worked quite a lot on trying to recreate a possible route. See, the plot may be right, whether Rama existed, whether this particular journey took place, we don't know. But but there is something about a knowledge of South India. So people on that basis at least have tried to recreate the possible route. And therefore, there's a lot of discussion on all of this. If you're interested, I can refer you to some material.
Sure, sir. So, in brief, I would like to repeat the first question. I hope you can hear me. Yeah.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
hear
The
you,
first
but
question.
yeah.
The first question was about the earthquake resistant structures in southern part of Saraswati cities, especially the Gujarat and the Sindh border. So, is there any evidence?
Okay, yeah, there is evidence at two locations. One is Dholavira, but it happens before the urban phase, about 2700 BC, approximate date. What is certain is that it is before the full mature urban phase. And Kalimangan also has an earthquake about that time, just before the urban phase, between the early and the mature phase. This is what at least Professor Bibilal proposed. You seem to have a massive earthquake. So after, in the phase of the Saraswati River, 1900 BC, where the river kind of collapses, there is no clear evidence, but what we do know is that there is constant neotectonics at work, constant motion of, the Indian plate sliding below the Himalayan plate. And therefore, you have constant small or larger seismic events happening. But as far as archaeological evidence is concerned, I'm not aware of earthquake evidence at the end of the mature phase. At the beginning of, yes, at those two locations at least, it is available.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, sir.
I can see as many as 2 questions followed by a brief on mind. So could I read those 2 questions, or you can see on your own, Professor Danino? Should I read out?
It is in this, yeah, I can read it. I can read
One
them.
is from Raghavendra Kupuswamy and the other one is from Divyam Garg.
Very well. So
But
the first question,
before that, Professor Danilo, just one small query. Varanasi or Harappa? Which one do you think is older?
Varanasi or?
Harappa. Harappa city is Lothal and all.
There is no comparison. Harappa is obviously much older because Harappa goes back in its full urban form to about 2600 BC. And in an earlier form as a kind of a town, growing town, it goes back it goes all the way to the Ravi phase, if I remember right, which will take us to almost 3500 BC.
So it's only a myth. It's only a myth that
Harappa is very ancient. As far as Varanasi is concerned, you see, there's a lot of misconception because a lot of settlements have been excavated by great archaeologists, including more recently Vidula Jaiswal, Vibha Tripathi, both of them from BHU. So there's been a lot of work. But what they found are isolated settlements. There's no evidence. That goes back to the second millennium BC. About, I think the most remote days are about 1300 BC. And those remote days cannot really be called a city as such. They are settlements which are going to converge, grow, and fuse together, and after a few centuries will create a city. So Varanasi is just as old as a city, just as old as, Mathura or possibly Ujjain, possibly Takshashila, and so on. It's not, we have these slogans in mind, the oldest city in the world. No, I'm sorry, that really doesn't work. So if I may take up Raghavendra Kupuswamy's question, he wants to know about the comparatively late use of bricks in the cities along the Ganges. Well, no, when the cities emerged, they were built with bricks. So you also have a lot of brick use in earlier pre-urban developments in the Gangetic region. Like I was mentioning, those settlements at Varanasi, they were built with bricks. And what are your opinions on the influence of late Harappan cities on settlements beyond the Deccan, such as Kiradi? Now, Kiradi has been much in the news. Frankly, Kiradi and all cities emerging in the south, which emerge about not before 500 BCE as per present dating. All these cities are not influenced by the Harappan civilization, which had already disappeared 1500 years earlier. But they are directly influenced by the growth of cities in the Gangetic region. Because from the Gangetic region, we have traders coming to the south, we have Jain monks, we have Buddhist monks, and all of these interact with pre-existing cultures in the Deccan, because again, the Deccan was quite populated by in the Paleolithic, in the Neolithic, in the Megalithic. All these phases had already quite a lot of very interesting developments, but not of an urban nature, of course. And this urban development takes place with, or at the same time as, or just after contact with North India. But that is in the first millennium BC. It's nothing to do with the Harappan cities. And all this propaganda that there's a lot of connection between these Tamil cities and Indus Harappan culture. No, it's a lot of misconception. If at all there are connections, it is through the Gangetic developments of the first millennium BC. So that's my brief answer. Divyam Garg asks, recently Haryana and Himachal Pradesh have signed an agreement to jointly work on revival of the Saraswati River. What are your views? Is it a practical project and what are the chances of success? Well, I know a little bit because I visited this area, which is precisely between the Markanda Valley on the north. I spent some time in the Markanda Valley, beautiful, beautiful valley. And then you have a small ridge of the Shivaliks, and then you come down into Haryana, where the small Saraswati, present Saraswati, still flows, doesn't flow much, it's not much of a river. The attempt has been to see, as far as I understand it, because I have not seen detailed reports, I have not seen plans, so you have to depend on newspaper articles, which is not, of course, a very good and complete source of information. But as far as I understand, the attempt is to channel more water into the basin of this little Saraswati, which will be joining the Ghagar a little further downstream in further away in Haryana. So I have seen some of those channels. Right now, there's not much water in them, except, as I said, during powerful monsoons, suddenly there's a lot of water, and Ghagar itself is very impressive. I saw the Markanda also in 2019 during a powerful monsoon, and it was quite impressive. It was a sizable river. So I assume that the attempt is there's a small dam which is created, if I understand well from the newspaper articles. This dam clearly is going to impound some water, but where is this water today? My understanding is that this water today would be flowing basically into the Yamuna. It would be flowing eastward. My understanding, but this is completely subject to verification, please, is that at present they will impound this water and then they will direct it westward so that more water will flow into the Saraswati system. Anyway, at the end of the day, it all goes to agriculture. That's what it does. At the end of the day, it will not flow, into the Rann of Kutch. By the time it reaches Punjab and Rajasthan, I think all the water will be gone anyway. And it will be gone, of course, for irrigation mostly. So this is a brief answer. Concerning Sharad Jain asked, water management, do we have some information about irrigation in Harappan civilization? That's a very good question. And the brief answer is nothing very striking. People were assuming for a long time that Harappans were building canals to take, water far away from the rivers. There's no clear evidence of canals unless you consider that they might have used natural ditches, what we call, the regular kind of nadis, which will be used to take seasonal, ditches which can take water. So they may have harvested some of that, they may have diverted some of that, but really irrigated agriculture in the sense that we understand today, except for probably very minor, in the field kind of agriculture, there's no strong evidence for this. So it doesn't mean it did not exist because, first of all, it's going to be difficult to detect. They did not obviously build canals, with concrete. So they may have been very happy with these little nalas, which are still all over the landscape. So it's not a clear answer in this case.
Professor,
Otherwise,
Professor
yes.
Jain, just a follow.
Yeah.
These people, they have built these great bath wells, etc. And they were living very close to rivers.
Yes.
Quite unlikely that when they faced this drought, they did not think of diverting river water, smart as they were. That was my.
It's very hard to, yes, I do understand your question, and it's a very good question, but it's very hard to give a definite answer. Because, see, some of the cities, like Mohenjo-Daro, would not have been affected anyway. The Indus was too big a river to ever go dry. It's more, the vulnerable regions would have been more like Gujarat. And interestingly, Gujarat remains completely occupied in the late Harappan phase. You have hundreds and hundreds of late Harappan sites in Gujarat. So it's not as if people move away. It's from the central Saraswati Basin, like Kalimangan, Banamali, Bhirana, that people do move away. And you don't get a late Harappan phase. So even though they had still wells, but perhaps the wells went dry. So water cannot be invented at the end of the day. Today we can have a 200-kilometer Narmada Canal from Maharashtra to Gujarat, and there was obviously no such option in those days. So even if there was local irrigation, even if they were using some nalas as makeshift canals, it would have been very much on a small scale. So yes, they were vulnerable to major changes in water supply. I agree. Anubhav Sinha asked if there is some suggestion that the language used in the Harappan civilization was akin to Dravidian language. Is it plausible if they have retroflex in their language? That of course we don't know, because we have no recording of any Harappan sound. And as far as Dravidian language is concerned, look, it's very simple. There have been many scholars working on this hypothesis, like, for example, Walter Fairservice, Asko Parpola and his team, Airavata Mahadevan, and also a Russian team under Kornosov. All of them proposed Dravidian readings, but all of them were incompatible with each other. None of them could agree on a common decipherment. So that's not very encouraging, and therefore right now no particular Dravidian reading of Harappan script is accepted by the scholarly community at large. The same situation, to be perfectly honest with you, with Sanskrit. A lot of scholars have tried to read Sanskrit in the text, which, remember, are very, very short. So it's not very, very difficult to bend those short inscriptions to what you might be reading in them. But at the end of the day, you have to produce a wholly consistent system of readings for all the 5,000 inscriptions that we do have. And it's the same with Sanskrit. There must have been about 24 of Sanskrit decipherments, and they are materially incompatible. That's the picture. So therefore, I have to remain completely agnostic, and I will not attempt to propose anything here because we don't have enough data. Another question. Okay. And drains to collect wastewater from household. Yes. Are there some indications whether they used to have decentralized or centralized system for water waste treatment? See, I don't think there is any water waste treatment anywhere. Mohenjo-Daro, which has the biggest sanitation system by far across all Harappan cities, probably did not bother. All it wanted was to take those waters away. There were 700 wells in Mohenjo-Daro. And there was plentiful water because the water table was very high. The Indus was nearby. There was no water shortage. Even in the late Harappan phase, I'm sure there was no water shortage. If the city collapsed, it was not for water reasons, but probably for collapse of trade or other reasons. So I think they were just happy evacuating the wastewater somewhere, and we cannot expect them to have been so insightful as to try to, but maybe some of it went to agriculture. It's not absolutely impossible. In Lothal, we do know that the wastewater from the Acropolis, the upper town, was dumped in the dockyard. That we do know because the drains go straight into the dockyard. So I don't think they were really worried about water treatment or disposal. Narendrajit Kaur asks, is it possible that certain principle of urban form that we physically see in Harappan civilizations remained as working principles across northwestern cities even in later phases, such as in the Rajputana towns? This is a very good question, and we may not be able to go all the way to the medieval era, if that is what you refer to. But there are many parallels in urbanism between the Harappan urbanism of the 3rd millennium BC and the Gangetic urbanism of the 1st millennium CT. Gangetic with also a little bit in the northwest, a little bit in the central region. Okay, so there a lot of scholars have worked. I've contributed modestly myself, and you can see that in my book on the Lost River. There is a chapter about all the technological continuities and also in urban features, such as the use of fortifications, such as the use of certain very clear construction techniques. Even this circular well with trapezoid bricks survives for a little while, and so on. So the point is that many scholars have proposed parallels between the two forms of urbanism. One of the best work is by Piotr Eltsov, And his book is From Harappa to Hastinapura. He's an American-Russian archaeologist. And he takes quite a lot of case studies from both urbanisms, and he finds that there's a lot in common. So if you wish, you can study his book. But yes, so of course, if you have some continuity with the Gangetic urbanism, then Gangetic urbanism itself being in continuity with later urbanism, you can extend if you like. But I think we should look at the first transmission link. Varun Dev Jamwal asks, are there any evidences of mining? That's a good question, and the answer is no. In the sense that stone mining, yes. Stone mining in the Khadir island of Dholavira, you have a proper quarry with half-finished section pillars and all that, yes. But if you mean metal mining, no. There's a lot of evidence of metal workshops, that is basically copper, bronze, gold, of course, silver, in Harappan cities, lots of metal workshops, furnaces, and so on. Not lots of furnaces, but enough, and therefore metal was smelted, worked in Harappan cities and towns. But where did they get the metal ore from remains a question. Now, one major hypothesis is that in the Aravalli Hills, there was a contemporary Ahar Banas civilization, actually a culture, because it had big towns, but it never created cities. And they were extracting very much. They were extracting from the Aravalli Hills copper, bronze. You know that Aravalli Hills are very rich in metal ore, and they're still exploited by big industries today. And there is a kind of a small set of evidence that they were in touch with the Harappans. And therefore, it could be that the Harappans bought from them through barter trade. Maybe the Harappans gave them some jewelry, some agricultural products, something, and took some of the metal ore. And also we know now pretty certainly that the Harappans were importing copper ingots from Oman. And so perhaps they were smart enough to avoid the hassle of having to do the mining themselves. If they found other people to do it for them, why not? So it's not a final answer. Please keep in mind, we need more evidence always. Then we have Vinayak asking what evidences suggest that the civilization was invaded. See, that's quite simple in archaeological terms. If you expect an invasion, you would have what is known as an intrusive culture suddenly appearing on the scene. You would have some new kinds of weapons, some new kind of art forms, some new kinds of maybe pottery, some new kinds of jewelry, etc. So you have what, archaeologists look at what they call a cultural assemblage. An assemblage means a set of artifacts, okay? And they are pretty good at being able to tell you whether a culture evolves in a gradual way or whether suddenly there's an intrusion of a different assemblage. Now, if there is an intrusion, it need not be a military invasion, of course. It could be that people resettled, maybe there was a drought somewhere else, people came and joined. There could be so many factors. But if there is an invasion, then you do expect positive evidence of two things. First, the coming of an intrusive culture, and that is visible nowhere. And two, some physical destruction. And for a long time, some skeletons found in Mohenjo-Daro streets were produced, a few of them, about 30, produced as evidence of warfare, a massacre by the Aryans and so on and so forth, until it was shown that they did not belong to the same periods and that there was no evidence of violence. Some bones were shown to have injuries, but the injuries had healed. So people did not die of these injuries and so on. So finally, the evidence was dropped. And this was actually a big rebuttal of Mortimer Wheeler by the American archaeologist George Dales. And he called it the mythical massacre. So since then, as far as I know, nobody is proposing any good evidence of a violent intrusion into any of the Harappan cities. So therefore, and you see, even let us assume that some place, maybe Mohenjo-Daro, though there is no evidence, let us assume that there is some invasion. We have cities all over the place, all the way to Uttar Pradesh, all the way to Gujarat and almost Maharashtra border, all the way to almost Iran. You can't have an invasion covering all these cities together. So therefore, this hypothesis is definitely not a very good one. And unless somebody produces new evidence, this would not work. Then Varun Dev says, well, this I think I have answered. Yes, that's true. Native forms of metal is not abundant for copper. For iron is very, very abundant, but iron metallurgy is not yet developed. It will be developed in the Gangetic civilization, right? So for iron, plentiful across India. But for copper, you're right. And therefore, they might have just got a good amount from the Gulf. Also from Balochistan, there is some evidence of copper mining there, but by whom is not clear. And as I said again, by in the Aravallis. Divyam Garg asks, how did you get studying? Well, somebody has to study it, no? If you don't study it, why can't I study it? So it's just fascinating, you see, to understand the origins and evolution of civilizations. And even as a child, I was reading a lot on the Egyptian civilization and so on. This is just my thing, that I want to understand where things come from. So therefore, I started studying and interacting with archaeologists in India and visiting sites and so on and so forth. And we ended up forming a Center for Archaeological Sciences here at IIT Gandhinagar. We have currently 3 resident archaeologists. Omkar Deepak Karmarkar asks, is it possible to make the recording available? Well, you have to ask the organizers. It's absolutely fine with me. If they did record, then why not? Narendrajit Kaur asks, is it possible that the trade routes of Uttar Pattha and Dakshina Pattha led to the city development in Indian peninsula? So absolutely, the answer is definitely yes, because it's now well understood by many scholars of texts, but also archaeologists, that these first of all, it's not a single line, as you know. This Uttarapatha is 4 or 5 roads, if not more. Dakshinapatha is probably 2 or 3, if not more. So these which are mentioned in Ashoka's edicts and also in a number of texts, like even perhaps Panini, at least Patanjali and some of the Dharma Sutras and some of those early texts do mention all these road networks. And definitely they existed before the rise of cities in the Indo-Gangetic civilization, the first millennium BC. They were all trade routes. Even Mehergarh in Balochistan in 6000 BC shows evidence of contacts with across the Hindu Kush. In the region of what is today Tajikistan, where lapis lazuli was mined, there was no lapis lazuli in the Indian subcontinent, and there is lapis lazuli in Mehergarh between, let's say, 5 and 6000 BC. That's even long before the Indus civilization. And already those distant trade networks were working. Even if it is in a limited way, they were already there. So yes, definitely this is a very good point. And India, Professor Mishra asks, we will try to make the recording available. Very good. Supreme Maheshwari says civilization got influence in the past by past civilization. Yes, we could see proto-Doric columns in Egyptian rock-cut temples and Vedic wooden architecture imitated in stone in Chaitya halls by the Buddhists. Absolutely, of course, you're right. This is all well known, and therefore civilizations have borrowed ideas from each other. It's very, very interesting, as a brief comment, that you see the Harappan civilization was in touch with at least civilizations of Central Asia, of the Persian Gulf, and all the way to Mesopotamia, and possibly that remains to be checked, some on the eastern coast of Africa. That remains to be firmly established. So these civilizations were interacting a lot, and yet they all kept their individuality. They all kept their cultural stamp and did not merge or fuse together, but they did borrow ideas from each other. And of course, in later times, for example, you take the case of Buddhism. Buddhism, went all the way to China, to Japan, to the Mediterranean world also, to some extent. And ideas travel, people pick them up. There's no copyright on ideas. And therefore, civilizations have influenced each other all the time, of course. So Harappans and early Vedic is a different cup of tea altogether. I don't think I will go into it because when do you place the early Vedic people? That is the difficulty. And there are big difficulties with the conventional date of 1500 BC. So this takes us, to the whole big debate on the date of the Rig Veda and possible Aryan immigration into India. And I don't know where there is no consensus today on, you say, Vedic villages and Vedic towns. Where are they? What is a Vedic village? What is a Vedic town? I don't know. I don't know. There is no consensus that this particular culture is Vedic. Of course, once you go into the first millennium BC, the Gangetic civilization, no doubt the Vedic stamp is there, and then you will have the Buddhist stamp and the Jain stamp and what. But if you're looking at the second, third millennium, a number of good scholars have proposed that Rig Veda could be contemporary or even a little bit earlier than the Harappan civilization, because it reflects Sarasvati in full flow, whereas Mahabharata and other texts are aware that Sarasvati has broken down and disappears in certain sections. And also, Rig Veda doesn't have the word brick. Rig Veda doesn't have the word rice, vrihi, etc. So there are a number of arguments. You can read people like Nicolas Casanas. You can read my own book. Nothing is proved at the end of the day. It's very, very hard to clinch those issues once and for all. And definitely the dominant theory remains that the Veda is composed in India from 1500 BC or so. But I still don't know at the end of the day what is a Vedic village or Vedic town. Because all the intermediary cultures of the second millennium BC, like the painted grayware, PGW, like the OCP, ochre color pottery, and the Bara culture and all that, are they Vedic? Are they not Vedic? It's very hard to decide these things. We need a whole proper methodology of correlating material evidence with the text. And people rush into conclusions without, first of all, establishing a proper methodology. So I will refrain from answering this question in any final way. So I think I've come to the end of the chat box, and maybe it's the time to thank all of you for listening to me patiently.
Thank you, Professor Danino. And before I request Professor Mishra to say vote of thanks, I must thank on my own. I must thank all these people, those who have questioned so brilliantly, like icing on a cake, as they say, or like petals on a beautiful flower. These questions and the people, those who have questioned, and the people, those who have attended this lecture, this talk, and I must thank them all. So, Professor Mishra, over to you for the formal vote of thanks to Professor Danilo for his brilliant lecture.
Thank you, Professor Sanjit Mishra. It is my duty to propose a vote of thanks. Professor Michel Danino, the esteemed speaker of Department Lecture Series of HSS Department, faculty members and students of IIT Roorkee. It is a great honor to propose a vote of thanks to all who have helped us in making this department lecture a resounding success. I would like to thank our distinguished speaker, Professor Danino, for thought-provoking and insightful lecture on Harappan civilization. Thank you, sir. I would like to give my hearty vote of thanks to the faculty members and the students who joined the department lecture series of Humanities and Social Sciences through WebEx platform. I would also like to thank the coordinator from the department, Professor Sanjit Mishra, for a crisp introduction to the speaker of this afternoon. Thank you, Professor Mishra. I mention my deepest sense of appreciation and place on record my hearty thanks to the students, volunteers, because of whom we could make this fun program possible. I specifically thank the people who have been the backbone of the event, the technical staff from ICC who helped us with the putting of the digital display and things like that. And once again, I thank all of you for your cordial cooperation. So thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Somebody has asked whether we could have mail ID of Professor Michel Danino. I think you have to visit the IIT Gandhinagar website and you'll find it there. This is in his email ID is in the official website of IIT Gandhinagar. So you can always reach out to him. And of course, regarding whether we can make the recording available in the public domain, we'll have a discussion with Professor Danino. Then, if it is possible, if he has gives us the permission, we'll definitely do it. Thank you all of you. Thank you, Professor Danino, once again for taking
My
time
thanks
out
to,
from
my thanks to you. My thanks to you.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And Professor Sanjit Mishra will get in touch with you for some other uh, matters related to the lecture. Fine. So we can end the meeting. We can
Yeah.
terminate this link right now, I think.
For now. For now.
Fine. Sanjit ji,
Yes, please do that. Please do
yeah.
that.
Please, can you please meet me in my office now?
Yeah. Right. I will do that.
Please.
Before this, please end the meeting.
All right. Please come and meet me. There's something official I would like to discuss.
I'm coming there. Please end the meeting first, officially and formally.